Why hello there everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In honor of spooky season, I wanted to talk about a specific spooky game series that's been with me my entire life, and that series would be
Resident Evil.
Now in this video specifically, I wanted to talk about the recent remakes that we've gotten in the last couple years. Excluding Resident Evil 4 remake, I wanted to specifically talk about Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and what these remakes were able to accomplish and what some of them were able to not accomplish. So strap in for this video on this spooky season as you ride into October and descend into Raccoon City.
Over here, stranger.
So Resident Evil 2's remake was a masterclass in remake. It showed how to reimagine a classic survival horror game for a new generation. Now, the Resident Evil series has been with me my entire life. I was about 1 and 2 years old when I remember seeing my father play these games. And since then, they're a video game series that's been nostalgic for me and something that's been with me through my entire life. And it's due to that I play these games to this day, and that even my dad plays these games still to this day. When Resident Evil 2 was remade in 2019, it set a benchmark for how to bring a beloved game into the modern era without losing its soul. Capcom didn't just slap on some shiny new graphics and call it a day. They rebuilt the game from the ground up, but stayed true to the atmosphere, the tension, and pacing that made the original game in 1998 so amazing. The remake felt like Resident Evil 2, but at the same time, it played like a modern game. The fixed camera angles that, everyone grew to love back in the day were replaced with an over-the-shoulder perspective, giving players a more immersive and immediate sense of dread. Now, I know this is kind of a divisive topic because there are people who love the fixed camera angles. While I personally feel like they were a product of their time, and I think that Capcom made the right choice in changing the gameplay format for the remakes moving forward and Resident Evil game. Now, it wasn't just all that, it was the sound design too. The sound design was honestly fucking terrifying. The tension that you felt throughout the entire game as you played through it was really like nothing else. Like, it felt like you were actually there. All the little creaks and noises that you hear throughout the entire police station, that you hear throughout the world that's around you, just made everything feel a lot more tense. What's more impressive about this is that Capcom was able to manage and balance both nostalgia and innovation. The locations were familiar, but with the addition of new puzzles, improved enemy AI, and the constant looming threat of Mr. X, it elevated the terror of the game to new heights. Speaking of Mr. X, he's a perfect example of what made the Resident Evil 2 remake work. He was a menace throughout the entire thing, constantly keeping you on edge, and his AI was brilliantly designed to keep the tension high without making the game feel unfair. I can still vividly remember the pounding sounds of his footsteps as you're sitting in a safe room, or even if he's like far away in a different room or on a different floor. Just the tension and fear that comes just from hearing his footsteps. The game doesn't really have to do much beyond this. This in and of itself makes it terrifying. It's not the zombies as much, it's not the lickers, it's just the sound design and just hearing the wind crackling through broken windows and hearing Mr. X's footsteps, knowing that he's somewhere around you. You don't know where, but you can hear him, and you can hear him coming. The balance of action and puzzle solving and exploration, along with the tight narrative that Resident Evil 2 weaves, is a nearly flawless imagining of it. It respected the original, but was bold enough to enhance and modernize it. They didn't just keep it the way it was, they made it better. Now, after talking all the praise and all the great things that Resident Evil 2 remake did, now I want to shift over to Resident Evil 3 remake. Because unfortunately, I feel like Capcom didn't put as much effort or time into this one as they did the other one. So Resident Evil 3 Remake, in my opinion, had all the potential in the world, but it just felt like they just ended up cutting too many corners. On the surface, the game looked fantastic. The visuals, just like in Resident Evil 2, were stellar, and Jill Valentine was an excellent protagonist to follow up. But once you dig a little deeper, the cracks in the game start to show. While Resident Evil 2 Remake expanded on the original game's strengths, RE3 Remake seemed to do the opposite. It trimmed down content. The original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis had a broader scope with more exploration, branching paths, and puzzles. It leaned heavily into survival horror with action elements woven in. But in the remake, it just felt like Capcom went all in on the action. The game became more of a fast-paced shooter than a survival horror experience. Areas like the clock tower, which were pivotal in the original, were entirely cut out or severely shortened. What could have been a deeper, more complex narrative and gameplay experience was reduced to a more linear and shorter game. RE3 Remake, I believe you could beat the game in about 4 to 5 hours. Now, Resident Evil games are known for being short, but that's like the standard first playthrough. It won't really take you much longer than that, which makes this game feel more like an expansion to Resident Evil 2 Remake than its own game, and one deserving of the title of sequel of Resident Evil 3. Now, the biggest problem that I feel like this game had is the Nemesis problem. You see, in the original, Nemesis was terrifying. He wasn't just a boss monster, he was an unpredictable, relentless force that could show up at any given time, anywhere in the map. Much like Mr. X did in the Resident Evil 2 remake. Nemesis should have been an unstoppable force of terror, but in the remake, Nemesis was kind of just scripted events that happened throughout the game. He felt more like a set piece than a dynamic threat. Sure, he looked great and his various forms were visually impressive, but the fear factor wasn't the same. You knew when he was going to show up, and the game rarely gave you that unpredictable sense of dread that the original delivered upon. This was probably the most disappointing for me because after seeing how terrifying it was in Resident Evil 2 Remake, constantly being chased throughout the police station by Mr. X, I was excited as fuck to see what they were going to do with Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 Remake. Because I know how the original was, and I know how Nemesis was chasing you all over the map, how he was that terrifying, looming presence that could just show up anywhere and just attack you. And I feel like they just dropped the ball on what they chose to do with his character in this one. Now, one of the other biggest issues with Resident Evil 3 Remake was its pacing and its content. While Resident Evil 2 Remake gave players room to breathe between moments of terror, balancing both exploration and combat, RE3 just felt rushed. The game was significantly shorter, and instead of expanding on the source material like RE2 did, RE3 just cuts a bunch of corners like I mentioned earlier. Entire sections were missing, puzzles were simplified, and there was very little incentive or reason to explore. Where RE2 rewarded players for thoroughly scouring the environment, RE3 kind of just pushed you from one set piece to the next. It felt more like a sprint than a survival horror game. And that's something that was just very disappointing for me and kind of just made the overall experience lackluster. It's not terrible by any means, but it doesn't really live up to the standards that was set before it. And RE3 is kind of one that's always been like the black sheep of the mainline Resident Evil games. And I felt like this was Capcom's opportunity to change that and make it something that was truly great. But instead, they kind of just dropped the ball and we just ended up with this. And RE3, it's kind of in the same spot that it was before. The remake didn't do anything to elevate it or change it to new heights. And unfortunately, because of that, Resident Evil 3 kind of just still stays the black sheep of the Resident Evil series. It's always, oh yeah, that one, instead of one that's on people's favorites, one that people always remember. They remember Nemesis, but the overall game of like RE3, for a lot of people who've played the series, is kind of just forgettable. In the end, Resident Evil 2 Remake succeeded because it understood what made the original great, and it amplified those strengths. It was a love letter to the fans of the classic game while introducing a new generation to the terror of Raccoon City. RE3 Remake, however, felt more like a missed opportunity. It wasn't a bad game, like I said, by any means. It was still fun, and it still looked great, but it failed to capture the essence of what made the original so special. Instead of enhancing it, like I said, it just streamlined it to the point of losing what made RE3 unique in the first place. At the end of the day, both these remakes had their moments, but Resident Evil 2 Remake set a new standard for how to bring a classic back to life. And I feel like it was the pivotal point or the pivotal video game that kind of ushered us into this era of remakes. Because Capcom did it so well, and it made every other company be like, oh shit, they remade their game and they did a great job. We can probably do that too. And if they choose to remake games beyond 4, hopefully they take a page from this playbook. So far with Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 4 Remake, they've been constant bangers, staying faithful to the source material while pushing the boundaries of what a remake can achieve. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Did you prefer Resident Evil 2 Remake, or did you prefer Resident Evil 3 Remake? Or are they games that you haven't yet played? Because we're in spooky season, so if you want to play them, I would say this is probably the best time. But with that being said, I'm the Offline Warrior, and I'll see you guys next time.